Relax with stories that help you sleep, work, and calm your mind. Today's story is called One Night at the Bar. We invite you to listen and support our channel by clicking subscribe and receiving channel notifications to conveniently follow the next videos. Sincerely, thank you. The Velvet Pulse was alive tonight, a pulsing heart in the belly of downtown Chicago. Tucked into a gritty corner of the city, its neon sign flickered like a siren's call, drawing in the restless, the heartbroken, and the reckless. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of whiskey, sweat, and cheap perfume, all swirling under a haze of red and purple lights that bled into each other like a bruise. The house music thumped, a relentless rhythm that sank into your bones, making your pulse race whether you wanted it to or not. Bodies packed the dance floor, moving in a chaotic, primal sync, while the bar counter gleamed under the dim glow of Edison bulbs, a sanctuary for those who came to drown their thoughts. Zoey fans slipped through the crowd, her red dress clinging to her like a second skin, catching the light with every step. At 27, she was a vision of defiance against the ache in her chest. 3 years of a relationship, 3 years of promises, late-night talks, and shared coffee cup shad crumbled 2 weeks ago when she found texts on his phone that weren't meant for her. Tonight, she wasn't Zoey the graphic designer, Zoey the loyal girlfriend, or Zoey the one who cried herself to sleep. She was Zoey the wildfire, here to burn away the hurt. Her dark hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, framing a face that was equal parts sharp and soft-high cheekbones, full lips painted crimson, and eyes that held a storm behind their kohl-lined edges. The dress hugged her curves, accentuating the dip of her waist and the gentle swell of her hips, its hem riding just high enough to tease the smooth expanse of her thighs. Every step she took was a dare, a silent scream to the universe. I'm still here. I'm still alive. She found a spot at the bar, sliding onto a stool with a grace that belied the chaos in her heart. The bartender was busy, a blur of motion behind the counter, but Zoey didn't care. She wasn't here for service. She was here for escape. Her fingers tapped the polished wood, matching the beat of the music as her gaze drifted over the crowd. People laughed, shouted, kissed, lost themselves in the night. She envied them their ability to let go, to forget who they were for a few hours. Her mind, though, kept circling back to him, the ex who didn't deserve the space he still occupied in her thoughts. Rough night? The voice was low, smooth, cutting through the noise like a blade. Zoey's eyes snapped to the man behind the bar, and for a moment, her breath caught. Julian Reyes was not what she'd expected. At 30, he carried himself with the kind of effortless confidence that didn't need to announce itself. His skin was a warm bronze, kissed by some distant sun, and his dark hair was cropped close, just long enough to hint at curls. A black button-up shirt clung to his frame, sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and inked with faint tattoos that disappeared under the fabric. His jaw was sharp, dusted with a shadow of stubble, but it was his eyes that stopped her cold, deep brown, almost black, with a spark that felt like it could ignite something dangerous. They weren't just eyes, they were a conversation, a challenge, a promise. He leaned against the counter, one hand braced on the edge, his body angled toward her in a way that felt both casual and deliberate. The faintest smirk tugged at his lips, not cocky but knowing, like he'd already seen through her walls and was waiting for her to catch up. Zoey arched a brow, refusing to let him unsettle her. Rough life. she shot back, her voice carrying a playful edge. You gonna fix it with a drink? Or just keep staring? His smirk widened, and damn if it didn't do something to her pulse. Depends on what you're running from. He straightened, grabbing a shaker without breaking eye contact. But I'll start with this. She watched as he worked, his movements fluid, almost hypnotic. His hands were strong, fingers deft as they measured out liquor, ice clinking in the shaker with a rhythm that matched the music. The muscles in his forearms flexed subtly, the tattoos shifting with each motion, and Zoey found herself wondering what stories they told. His shoulders were broad but not bulky, his frame lean yet solid, the kind of body that looked like it could hold you together or break you apart, depending on the mood. He wasn't pretty boy handsome. He was raw, real, the kind of man who looked like he belonged in a bar like this, pouring drinks and stealing breaths. He slid a glass toward her, the drink a deep amber with a cherry nestled in its depths, glowing under the bar's dim lights. "Midnight kiss," he said, his voice dropping just enough to make the name sound like a secret. "Tastes like trouble. Think you can handle it?" Zoey's lips curved, a spark of mischief lighting her eyes. She leaned forward, her dress dipping slightly to reveal the smooth curve of her collarbone, the barest hint of cleavage. "Trouble's my middle name tonight." She lifted the glass, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second, enough to send a jolt through her, warm and electric. His skin was warm, calloused at the tips, and she wondered what those hands would feel like elsewhere. She took a sip, and the drink hit her like a slow burn whiskey, a hint of sweet vermouth, and something smoky she couldn't place. It was bold, unapologetic, just like the man who'd made it. Her eyes flicked up to meet his, and there it was, the look. Not a cheesy pickup line, not a sleazy once-over, but a gaze that stripped her bare without making her feel cheap. It was intense, unguarded, like he saw her, not just the dress, not just the attitude, but her, the Zoey who was hurting, the Zoey who was daring the night to give her something worth feeling. His eyes said, "You're here for the music, for the escape, but maybe, just maybe, you're here for me." The bar seemed to fade, the noise dulling to a hum. The crowd, the lights, the thumping basset all blurred, leaving just the two of them in this pocket of time. Zoey's heart kicked harder, not from the alcohol, but from the weight of that gaze. She felt seen, wanted, in a way that made her skin hum. Her lips parted, ready to say something inny to keep this moment from slipping away, but Julian beat her to it. "Name's Julian," he said, leaning closer, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her. "And you? You look like you're about to start a fire." Zoey's laugh was soft, genuine, cutting through her own defenses. "Zoey," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "And maybe I am. You got a match?" His eyes darkened, that smirk turning into something hungrier, and for the first time that night, Zoey didn't think about her ex. She didn't think about the pain. She thought about Julian He's hands, his voice, the way his shirt stretched across his chest when he moved. She thought about what it would be like to let go, to let the music and the night and this man pull her under. The velvet pulse kept pulsing, the crowd kept moving, but Zoey and Julian were locked in their own rhythm now. A glance had turned into a spark, and the night was young. Whatever came next, Zoey knew one thing. She wasn't running anymore, not from this. The velvet pulse throbbed around Zoey Fan, its heartbeat a relentless bass line that seemed to sync with the pulse in her throat. The red and purple lights cast a dreamlike haze over the bar, painting her skin in hues that made her feel like she was part of the night's fever. Her red dress clung to her, the fabric a bold declaration of her intent to forget, to feel, to live tonight. The midnight kiss sat half drunk in front of her, its smoky sweetness lingering on her tongue, a reminder of the man who'd poured it, Julian Reyes. His name rolled through her mind, like the aftertaste of the whiskey, sharp and intoxicating. Zoey leaned against the bar, one elbow propped on the polished wood, her body angled just enough to invite attention without screaming for it. Her dark hair spilled over one shoulder, catching the light in glossy waves, and her crimson lips curved into a faint, defiant smile. She was 27, freshly wounded, but tonight she was rewriting her story. No more tears for a man who didn't deserve them. No more nights lost to what-ifs. She was here, in this moment, and the air crackled with possibility. Across the counter, Julian moved with a predator's grace, his hands a blur as he poured drinks for a group of loud frat boys at the far end. Zoey watched him, unapologetically. His black shirt hugged his frame, the fabric stretching across his shoulders and chest with every motion, hinting at the strength beneath. His forearms, exposed by rolled-up sleeves, were a map of lean muscle and faded ink tattoos that teased stories she wanted to unravel. A thin silver chain glinted at his neck, resting against the hollow of his throat, and Zoe's gaze lingered there, imagining the warmth of his skin, the faint pulse she'd feel if she pressed her lips to it. His face was a study in contrasts, sharp jawline, shadowed with stubble, but softened by eyes that held a quiet fire. Those eyes deep, dark, almost liquid had locked onto hers earlier, and the memory of that look still sent a shiver down her spine. He caught her staring now, and the corner of his mouth quirked up, a smirk that was equal parts challenge and invitation. Zoey didn't look away. She tilted her head slightly, letting her hair slide further down her shoulder, exposing the smooth curve of her neck. Her dress dipped low at the chest, revealing just enough to make her feel powerful, desired. The fabric hugged her waist, accentuating the flare of her hips, and as she shifted on the stool, the hem rode up slightly, bearing a sliver of thigh. She knew the effect she had, and tonight, she wasn't afraid to wield it. Julian finished with the frat boys and sauntered back toward her, wiping his hands on a bar towel. He moved like he owned the space, every step deliberate, his body radiating a quiet confidence that made her pulse kick up a notch. He stopped in front of her, leaning one hip against the counter, close enough that she caught the faint scent of his cologne, something woodsy, with a hint of spice that made her want to lean closer. "Still nursing that drink?" he asked, his voice low, a velvet rasp that cut through the bar's noise. His eyes flicked to the glass, then back to her, lingering on her lips for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Zoey lifted the midnight kiss, swirling it slowly, the cherry bobbing in the amber liquid. "Savoring it," she said, her voice carrying a playful edge. "Good things shouldn't be rushed." His smirk deepened, and damn if it didn't make her stomach flip. "Is that right?" He reached for a bottle of bourbon, his fingers wrapping around the neck with a casual grip that made her wonder what else those hands could do. "Then let's see if I can make you savor something else." He didn't ask what she wanted. He didn't need to. Julian seemed to read her like a book, picking up on the vibe she was giving of restless, bold, ready to dive into whatever the night offered. He grabbed a shaker, tossing it lightly in one hand before setting it down. His movements were a performance, each one drawing her in. He poured a measure of bourbon, followed by a splash of something dark and syrupy, his fingers steady, precise. The muscles in his forearms flexed as he shook the drink, the tattoos shifting like shadows under his skin. Zoe's eyes traced the lines of his body, the way his shoulders rolled, the subtle taper of his waist, the way his jeans hung low on his hips, hinting at the strength in his legs. He was built like someone who could carry you through a storm or pin you against a wall, and the thought sent a rush of heat through her. He slid the new drink toward her. No name, no explanation, just a glint in his eyes that said, "Trust me." The glass was cool against her fingers, the liquid inside a deep ruby red that glowed under the bar's dim lights. She raised it to her lips, holding his gaze, and took a sip. It was bull-tart cherry, a bite of citrus, and a warm, spicy undertone that lingered like a kiss. It was perfect, like he'd reached into her soul and poured what she needed. "Not bad," she said, licking her lips slowly, catching the way his eyes tracked the Robin Hood. "You're not gonna believe this, but I just saw a guy in a red dress sipping a midnight kiss at the Velvet Pulse, and let me tell you, it was a vibe." The Velvet Pulse was a living thing, its heartbeat a relentless house track that pulsed through the walls, the floor, the very air Zoe Fawn breathed. The bar's red and purple lights swirled around her, casting her in a glow that made her red dress look like it was woven from embers. The fabric hugged her body like a lover, clinging to the curve of her waist, the swell of her hips, and the smooth expanse of her thighs, its hem teasing just above mid-thigh. At 27, Zoe was a vision of defiance and desire, her dark hair tumbling in loose waves over her shoulders, framing a face that was both fierce and vulnerable. Her crimson lips, still tingling from the cherry-spiked drink Julian had poured, curved into a half-smile, and her eye a stormy, kohl-lined, and alive, with a reckless spark locked onto the man who'd just set her world on fire with a single look. Julian Reyes stood behind the bar, but he was no longer just the bartender. At 30, he was a force-raw, magnetic, the kind of man who could make you forget your own name with a glance. His black button-up shirt stretched across his broad shoulders, the sleeves rolled to reveal forearms corded with muscle and etched with tattoos that seemed to pulse with stories untold. His dark hair was cropped close, just long enough to hint at curls, and his jaw, shadowed with stubble, was sharp enough to cut glass. But it was his eyes deep, dark, burning with a quiet intensity that held Zoe captive. They weren't just looking at her, they were claiming her, pulling her into a world where the music, the night, and the heat between them were all that mattered. His lean frame moved with a predator's grace, every gesture deliberate, from the way he leaned against the counter to the faint smirk tugging at his lips. That smirk was a promise, a dare, and Zoe was ready to answer. The bar was packed, bodies swaying and grinding on the dance floor, but Zoe's world had narrowed to the space between her and Julian. The ruby-red drink he'd made her unnamed, bold, and spiked with a heat that matched her mood set half-finished on the counter, its tart sweetness still lingering on her tongue. Their conversation had been brief, a dance of words as electric as the music, and now the air between them crackled with something unspoken. Zoe leaned forward on her stool, her dress dipping slightly to reveal the smooth curve of her collarbone, the barest hint of cleavage. Her legs crossed, the motion pulling the hem of her dress higher, bearing a sliver of thigh that caught the light. She knew the effect she had, and tonight, She wielded it like a weapon. Julian's eyes flicked over her, slow and deliberate, taking in every detail, the way her hair framed her face, the way her lips parted slightly, the way her body seemed to hum with the music. He set down the bar towel he'd been holding, his movements unhurried, and leaned closer, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. "You dance, Zoey?" Her name on his lips felt like a caress, and she tilted her head, letting her hair slide over one shoulder, exposing the delicate line of her neck. "Depends," she said, her voice playful but edged with challenge. "You asking me to dance, or just curious?" His smirk widened, and he straightened, his body unfolding with a grace that made her pulse race. "I don't ask," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "I show." Before she could respond, he moved swift, decisive, like a man who knew exactly what he wanted. He stepped out from behind the bar, nodding to another bartender who took over without a word. Julian's presence seemed to shift the air, drawing eyes from the crowd, but he didn't notice or care. His focus was on Zoey, and Zoey alone. He rounded the counter, his jeans hugging his hips, hinting at the strength in his legs, and stopped in front of her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. His cologne woodsy, with a hint of spice wrapped around her, and she fought the urge to lean closer, to breathe him in. He extended a hand, palm up, his fingers strong and slightly calloused, the tattoos on his forearm peeking out from under his sleeve. "Come on," he said, his voice low, commanding, but with a softness that made her heart skip. "Let's see what you've got." Zoey's lips curved into a smile, equal parts mischief and surrender. She slid off the stool, her movements slow, deliberate, letting her body brush close to his as she stood. The red dress clung to her, accentuating every curve, the dip of her waist, the gentle swell of her breasts, the long, toned lines of her legs. She placed her hand in his, her fingers slim and warm against his rougher skin, and the contact sent a jolt through her, electric and undeniable. His grip was firm but not possessive, guiding her with a confidence that made her feel both safe and reckless. He led her to the dance floor, weaving through the crowd with ease, his hand never leaving hers. The music shifted, a slower, deeper track, with a bass line that vibrated through her chest, urging her body to move. The dance floor was a sea of bodies, but Julian carved out a space for them, a pocket of intimacy in the chaos. He turned to face her, his eyes never leaving hers, and stepped closer, his body just inches from hers. The air between them felt charged, like the moment before a storm. Zoey's heart pounded, not from nerves, but from the raw, unfiltered want coursing through her. She tilted her chin up, meeting his gaze, and let her body sway to the music, her hips moving in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Julian mirrored her, his movements fluid, controlled, but with an edge of hunger. He placed one hand on her waist, his fingers splaying across the curve of her hip, the heat of his touch searing through the thin fabric of her dress. His other hand lifted, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his thumb grazing her cheek for a fleeting moment. The contact was light, but it set her skin alight, every nerve ending singing. They moved together, bodies syncing with the beat, the space between them shrinking with every sway. Zoey's hands found his chest, her fingers spreading over the firm planes of muscle beneath his shirt, feeling the steady thrum of his heartbeat. His body was a study in contrast, hard, where it needed to be, but with a suppleness that made him move like liquid. His shoulders were broad, his chest solid, and as her hands slid higher, she felt the faint ridge of his collarbone, the warm skin at the base of his throat where his silver chain rested. She wanted to press her lips there, to taste the salt of his skin, but she held back, letting the tension build. Julian's hand on her waist tightened slightly, pulling her closer until their bodies brushed her breasts, grazing his chest, her thighs whispering against his. The friction was electric, a slow burn that spread through her like wildfire. His other hand slid to the small of her back, his fingers tracing the dip of her spine, and Zoey arched into him, her body responding instinctively. Her dress rode up slightly, baring more of her thighs, and she felt his gaze drop for a moment, taking in the sight of her, before returning to her eyes. That look, it was hunger, reverence, and something deeper, something that made her feel like the only woman in the room. The music pulsed, the bass line a heartbeat they both followed. Zoey's hips swayed, her body rolling against his, and Julian matched her, his movements a perfect counterpoint. His thigh slipped between hers, just enough to guide her rhythm, and the contact sent a rush of heat through her. Her hands slid to his shoulders, her fingers digging into the muscle there, and she tilted her head back, exposing the long line of her throat. Julian's breath hitched. She felt it in the way his chest rose, and his hand on her back slid lower, resting just above the curve of her ass, possessive but not demanding. Their faces were close now, so close she could feel the warmth of his breath on her lips. His eyes were dark, endless, pulling her in like a tide. Zoey's lips parted, her breath shallow, and she saw the same want mirrored in his gaze. The world fell away, the bar, the crowd, the music, until it was just them, two bodies moving as one, two hearts beating in sync. Her hands slid to the back of his neck, her fingers threading through the short curls at his nape, and she felt him tense, a low sound rumbling in his throat. Their lips were inches apart, the air between them heavy with anticipation. Zoey's body was alive, every touch, every brush of his skin against hers, setting her nerves on fire. She wanted to close the distance, to taste him, to let the night take them wherever it wanted. And then, as the music hit a crescendo, Julian leaned in, his lips brushing hers. Not a kiss, not yet, but a promise. The barest touch, soft but searing, like a spark waiting to ignite. Zoey's breath caught, her body stilling for a moment, and then she pressed closer, her lips grazing his in return. The contact was fleeting, a tease, but it was enough to make her head spin. When she pulled back, their eyes locked, and the world snapped back into focus. The music, the lights, the heat of the crowd, but nothing else mattered. Not her ex, not the pain, not the life waiting outside these walls. There was only Julian, his hands on her body, his breath mingling with hers, his eyes promising a night she'd never forget. The song ended, but they didn't stop moving, their bodies still swaying, still connected. Julian's hand slid up her back, his fingers brushing the bare skin at the base of her neck, and he leaned in, his lips brushing her ear. "Your trouble, Zoey," he murmured, his voice a low growl that sent a shiver through her. "And I'm not sure I mind." She laughed, soft and breathless, and pressed her body closer, letting him feel the heat of her, the want in her. "Good," she whispered back, her lips grazing his jaw, tasting the faint salt of his skin. "Because I'm just getting started." The dance floor pulsed around them, But Zoey and Julian were in their own world, bodies entwined, hearts racing, the night stretching out before them like an open road. Whatever came next, Zoey knew one thing: she was all in. The night air outside the Velvet Pulse was cool, a sharp contrast to the fevered heat Zoey Fan and Julian Reyes had left behind. Chicago's downtown streets glistened under the faint drizzle, the neon signs reflecting in puddles like scattered dreams. Zoey's red dress clung to her, still warm from the dance floor, its fabric molded to the curves of her body, the dip of her waist, the gentle swell of her breasts, the long toned lines of her thighs. At 27, she was a vision of reckless beauty, her dark hair slightly mussed from Julian's fingers, her crimson lips parted as she caught her breath, her kohl-lined eyes, stormy and alive, flickered with a mix of anticipation and surrender as she stood close to Julian, their bodies still humming from the dance that had set their world ablaze. Julian, at 30, was a study in raw magnetism. His black button-up shirt was unbuttoned at the collar now, revealing a sliver of bronzed skin and the faint edge of a tattoo that dipped below his collarbone. His dark hair, cropped close, glistened with a sheen of sweat, and his jaw, shadowed with stubble, was set in a way that made him look both dangerous and inviting. His eyes deep, dark, burning with a hunger that hadn't dimmed since their first glance locked onto Zoey's, holding her in place as surely as his hands had on the dance floor. His lean frame moved with a quiet confidence, his jeans hugging his hips and thighs, hinting at the strength that had pressed against her during their dance. The silver chain at his neck caught the streetlight, a small detail that made Zoey want to trace it with her lips, to feel the warmth of his skin beneath. They hadn't spoken much since leaving the bar. There was no need. The air between them was thick with understanding, a silent agreement that tonight wasn't about wordset, was about feeling, about losing themselves in each other. Julian's hand rested lightly on the small of her back, his fingers brushing the bare skin just above her dress's low cut, sending a shiver through her. Zoey leaned into his touch, her body responding instinctively, her hip grazing his as they walked. Their laughter was soft, shared glances sparking with mischief and want. They didn't ask names, didn't exchange promises. They didn't need to. The night had its own rules, and they were playing by them. A few blocks from the bar, Julian led her to a nondescript building, its facade worn but clean, the kind of place that rented rooms by the hour and asked no questions. Zoey didn't care. She didn't want a penthouse or a fairy tale. She wanted this raw, real, unscripted. Julian pushed open the glass door, his hand still on her back, guiding her inside. The lobby was dim, lit by a single yellow bulb, and the clerk barely looked up as Julian slid cash across the counter. A key was handed over, and they were moving again up a narrow staircase, their footsteps muffled by the threadbare carpet. The room was small, simple, but clean a bed with crisp white sheets, a wooden chair by the window, a bedside lamp casting a warm, golden glow. The faint patter of rain against the window added a soft rhythm to the silence, a counterpoint to the pounding of Zoey's heart. Julian closed the door behind them, the click of the lock loud in the quiet, and turned to face her. For a moment, they just stood there, eyes locked, the space between them charged with a tension that felt like it could spark into flame. Zoey's breath hitched as Julian stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate, like a predator savoring the approach. His eyes roamed over her, taking in every detail: the way her dress clung to her curves, the way her hair framed her face in soft waves, the way her lips parted slightly, inviting him without a word. She felt exposed under his gaze, but not vulnerable, desired, powerful, like she was the only thing in his universe. Her body hummed, every nerve ending alive, and she tilted her chin up, meeting his gaze with a defiance that masked the ache in her chest. She wasn't thinking about her ex now, or the pain of betrayal. She was thinking about Julian's hands, his mouth, the way his body had felt against hers on the dance floor. He stopped just inches from her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, smell the faint, woodsy spice of his cologne mixed with the salt of his skin. His hand lifted, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face, the touch feather-light but electric. "You sure about this?" he asked. His voice, a low rumble, soft but edged with something raw. It wasn't doubt, it was respect, a moment to let her choose. Zoe's lips curved into a smile, bold and unapologetic. "I'm here, aren't I?" she said, her voice husky, carrying a challenge. She stepped closer, closing the gap, her body brushing against his breasts, grazing his chest, her hips whispering against his thighs. The contact sent a jolt through her, and she saw his eyes darken, his breath catch. That was all it took. Julian's hand slid to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair, and he pulled her to him, his lips crashing against hers. The kiss was everything their dance had promised, wild, hungry, but with a softness that made her knees weak. His mouth was warm, tasting of whiskey and want, and Zoey melted into it, her lips parting to let him in. Her hands found his chest, fingers spreading over the firm planes of muscle, feeling the rapid thud of his heart beneath his shirt. She pressed closer, her body molding to his, the red dress a thin barrier between them. Julian's other hand slid to her waist, his fingers splaying across the curve of her hip, pulling her tighter against him. The friction was electric, her breasts pressed against his chest, her thighs brushing his, and Zoey felt a rush of heat pool low in her belly. His lips moved against hers, slow and deliberate now, savoring every second, his tongue tracing the seam of her mouth before dipping inside, a dance as intimate as the one they'd shared in the bar. She moaned softly, the sound swallowed by the kiss, and felt him smile against her lips, a flicker of triumph that made her want to push him further. Her hands slid to his shoulders, fingers digging into the muscle there, and she tugged at his shirt, pulling it free from his jeans. Julian broke the kiss just long enough to let her, his eyes locked on hers, dark and burning. He shrugged the shirt off, letting it fall to the floor, and Zoey's breath caught at the sight of him. His chest was broad, sculpted, with a dusting of dark hair that trailed down to the taut planes of his abdomen. The tattoo she'd glimpsed earlier stretched across his chest, an intricate design of lines and shadows that seemed to pulse with his heartbeat. His skin was warm, bronzed, and she couldn't resist reaching out, her fingers tracing the lines of his collarbone, the ridge of his pecs, the faint scars that told stories she wanted to learn. Julian's hands weren't idle. He found the zipper at the back of her dress, his fingers brushing the bare skin of her spine as he tugged it down, slow and deliberate. The fabric loosened, slipping from her shoulders, and Zoey stepped back, letting it fall. The dress pooled at her feet, leaving her in nothing but a black lace bra and matching panties, her body exposed to the cool air and his heated gaze. She stood tall, unashamed, letting him look. Her skin was smooth, her curves soft but toned, her breasts full and straining against the lace, her hips flaring in a way that made her feel powerful, desired. Her thighs were long, strong, and she shifted slightly, letting the light catch the lines of her body, knowing the effect it would have. Julian's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening as he took her in. "Fuck, Zoey," he murmured, his voice rough, reverent. He stepped closer, his hands finding her waist, his fingers tracing the curve of her hips, the dip of her spine. His touch was firm but gentle, exploring her like she was something precious, something he wanted to memorize. Zoe's breath hitched as his hands slid higher, brushing the undersides of her breasts, his thumbs grazing the lace before slipping beneath it. Her nipples hardened under his touch, and she arched into him, a soft gasp escaping her lips. He kissed her again, slower this time, his lips moving from her mouth to her jaw, trailing down the column of her throat. His stubble grazed her skin, a delicious contrast to the softness of his lips, and Zoey tilted her head back, giving him access. His hands roamed, one sliding to the small of her back, the other cupping her breast, his thumbs circling her nipple through the lace. The sensation was overwhelming, a mix of heat and need that made her head spin. She tugged at his belt, her fingers fumbling with the buckle, and Julian chuckled against her skin, the sound low and wicked. "Impatient," he teased, his lips brushing the sensitive spot just below her ear. But he helped her, undoing the belt and letting his jeans fall, revealing black boxer briefs that hugged his hips and thighs, leaving little to the imagination. Zoe's eyes flicked down, taking in the hard lines of his body, the taut muscles of his abdomen, the strong columns of his legs, the obvious evidence of his desire. He was beautiful, raw, and she wanted every inch of him. They moved to the bed, a tangle of limbs and heat, the sheets cool against their skin. Julian lay back, pulling her with him, and Zoey straddled his hips, her thighs bracketing his, her hands braced on his chest. His hands found her hips, guiding her as she rocked against him, the friction sending sparks through her. Her bra was gone now, discarded somewhere on the floor, and Julian's eyes drank her in, his hands cupping her breasts, his thumbs brushing her nipples until she gasped. Her skin was flushed, her hair a wild cascade around her shoulders, and she felt like a goddess, powerful and untamed. He sat up, his arms wrapping around her, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was all heat and hunger. His hands roamed her back, tracing the curve of her spine, the swell of her ass, and Zoe pressed closer, her body aching for more. She could feel him, hard and ready beneath her, and the thought made her dizzy with want. Her fingers threaded through his hair, tugging gently, and he groaned, the sound vibrating through her. They moved together, slow at first, savoring every touch, every kiss. Julian's hands were everywhere, her thighs, her hips, her breasts, learning her body like a map he wanted to memorize. Zoe's hands explored him in return, tracing the lines of his tattoos, the ridges of his muscles, the warmth of his skin. Every touch was a conversation, a give and take that felt like more than just physical. It was connection, raw and real, two people finding something in each other they hadn't known they needed. When they finally came together, it was like the music from the bar had followed thema rhythm that built and broke, slow and then urgent. Zoe's body arched, her breath coming in gasps, and Julian's hands steadied her, his lips whispering her name against her skin. It wasn't just sex, it was a reclaiming, a rediscovery of themselves and each other. Every movement, Every touch was deliberate, unhurried, but charged with a need that consumed them both. Afterward, they lay tangled in the sheets, their bodies slick with sweat, their breath slowing. Zoe's head rested on Julian's chest, her fingers tracing the lines of his tattoo, feeling the steady thud of his heart. His arm was around her, his fingers brushing lazy circles on her back, and for the first time in weeks, Zoe felt at peace. The rain outside continued its soft patter, a lullaby that lulled her into a hazy, sated calm. They didn't speak, didn't need to. The room, the night, their bodies, they said everything. Zoe closed her eyes, letting herself drift, knowing that whatever came next, this moment was hers. And Julian, with his warmth, his strength, his quiet intensity, was part of it. The first light of dawn crept through the rain-streaked window, a soft, pale glow that bathed the small rented room in a hazy warmth. The patter of the night's drizzle had faded to a faint whisper, leaving behind a quiet that felt both sacred and fragile. Zoe Fan stirred, her body heavy with the languid satisfaction of a night spent in abandon, her mind still caught in the dreamlike haze of what had transpired. The crisp white sheets were tangled around her, cool against her bare skin, and the faint scent of Julian Reyes' woodsy cologne, salt, and something uniquely him lingered on her, grounding her in the reality of the moment. At 27, Zoe was a vision even in repose, her dark hair fanned across the pillow in messy waves, her crimson lipstick long since kissed away, leaving her full lips soft and slightly swollen. Her body, still flushed from their intimacy, was a map of curves and strength, her breasts full, her waist a gentle dip, her hips flaring into long, toned thighs that had wrapped around Julian with a hunger she hadn't known she possessed. She blinked slowly, her kohl-lined eyes adjusting to the dim light, and realized she didn't remember falling asleep. The night had been a blur of sensation. Julian's hands, his lips, the way their bodies had moved together like they were writing a song only they could hear. Her heart gave a quiet thud as she turned her head, seeking him, and found him sitting by the window, his silhouette framed against the faint dawn. Julian was shirtless, his bronzed skin catching the light in a way that made him look like a sculpture carved from warmth and shadow. His dark hair was tousled, his jaw shadowed with stubble, and a cigarette dangled loosely between his fingers, unlit, as if he'd picked it up out of habit but hadn't committed to it. His broad shoulders were relaxed, but there was a tension in the way he held himself, like he was caught between staying and slipping away. The tattoos across his chest and arms seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his breath, their intricate lines telling stories Zoe still wanted to unravel. She watched him for a moment, her breath shallow, taking in every detail. His chest was sculpted, with a dusting of dark hair that trailed down to the taut planes of his abdomen, where the faint ridges of muscles spoke of strength honed by life, not a gym. His arms, resting casually on his knees, were corded with muscle, the tattoos wrapping around them like vines, disappearing into the shadows of his skin. The silver chain at his neck glinted faintly, a small anchor that drew her eye to the hollow of his throat, where she'd pressed her lips hours ago, tasting the salt and heat of him. His jeans were slung low on his hips, unbuttoned, hinting at the power in his legs, the memory of how they'd felt pressed against hers. He was beautiful, raw, the kind of man who could break your heart and make you thank him for it. Julian turned his head, sensing her gaze, and their eyes met. His deep, dark, and endlessly expressive held hers with a quiet intensity that made her pulse quicken. There was no trace of the smirk he'd worn at the bar, no playful challenge, just a raw, unguarded look that said he saw her, all of her, the Zoey who'd been broken, the Zoey who'd burned bright in his arms, the Zoey who was waking up to a new day with no map for what came next. Her lips parted, ready to say something, but the words didn't come. They didn't need to. The silence between them was a language of its own, heavy with understanding. He set the cigarette down on the windowsill, unlit, and stood, his movements fluid, deliberate. Zoe's eyes followed him, drinking in the way his body moved, the roll of his shoulders, the subtle flex of his abdomen, the way his jeans shifted against his hips. He crossed the room to a small table where a coffee pot sat, its glass carafe catching the dawn's light. He poured a cup, the steam rising in lazy curls, and turned back to her, holding it out. The simple gesture felt intimate, like a secret shared between them. "Coffee?" he asked, his voice a low rumble, rough from the night but soft with something she couldn't name. He stepped closer, stopping at the edge of the bed, and Zoe sat up, pulling the sheet around her chest, not out of modesty, but because the air felt cool against her flushed skin. Her breasts pressed against the fabric, the outline of her body still a quiet invitation, and she saw Julian's eyes flicker, taking her in before returning to her face. She took the cup, her fingers brushing his, the contact sending a small spark through her. The coffee was black, strong, and she sipped it, letting the bitter warmth ground her. "Thanks," she said, her voice husky, still carrying the weight of sleep and satisfaction. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his, and for a moment, they just held each other's gaze, the room fading around them. Julian sat on the edge of the bed, close enough that she could feel the heat of him, but not touching. His hands rested on his thighs, fingers loose, but she could see the faint tension in his knuckles, like he was holding something back. His chest rose and fell with steady breaths, the tattoo across it shifting slightly, and Zoe wanted to reach out, to trace its lines again, to feel the warmth of his skin under her fingers, but she didn't. Not yet. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft but direct, cutting through the quiet like a blade. It wasn't a casual question, it was a check-in, a moment to make sure she was still with him, still whole after the night they'd shared. Zoe's lips curved into a small smile, genuine, unguarded. "Better than okay," she said, her voice steady, though her heart gave a quick thud at the memory of his hands on her, his lips against her skin. She set the coffee cup on the bedside table, the sheet slipping slightly to reveal the curve of her shoulder, the smooth line of her collarbone. She didn't adjust it, letting him see her, letting the moment stretch. Julian's eyes darkened, but he didn't move closer. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his hands braced on the bed, his body open but not demanding. "You're not what I expected," he said, his voice low, thoughtful. "When you walked into the bar, I thought, trouble, but you're more than that." Zoe tilted her head, her hair sliding over one shoulder, catching the light in glossy waves. "Trouble's not a bad start," she teased, her smile widening. "But I'll take more." She paused, her eyes searching his, looking for the man behind the bartender, the DJ, the lover. "What about you? What's your more?" He chuckled, a low, warm sound that made her stomach flip. "Still figuring that out," he said, his eyes holding hers, honest in a way that caught her off guard. But last night, that felt like a piece of it. Her breath caught, not because of the words, but because of the way he said them raw, real, like he was letting her see a part of him he didn't show often. She wanted to ask more, to peel back the layers of Julian Reyes, but the moment felt too delicate, like a soap bubble that might burst if she pushed too hard. Instead, she leaned forward, the sheet slipping further, baring the tops of her breasts, and reached out, her fingers brushing his wrist. His skin was warm, the tattoos under her touch, a tactile map she wanted to explore again. Last night was, she trailed off, searching for the right word, but nothing felt big enough. Real, she settled on, her voice soft but firm. More real than anything I've felt in a long time. Julian's eyes softened, and he turned his hand, catching her fingers in his thumb brushing over her knuckles. The touch was simple, but it sent a shiver through her, a reminder of how easily he could unravel her. "Good," he said, his voice a quiet promise, "because I'm not sure I'm ready to let that go." The words hung between them, heavy with possibility, but neither of them moved to define it. This wasn't the time for promises or plans. It was a moment to feel, to exist in the afterglow of what they'd shared. Zoey's heart raced, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned closer, her body shifting, the sheet falling to her waist, leaving her upper body bare. She didn't cover herself, didn't feel the need to. Julian's eyes flicked down, taking in the sight of her full breasts, the soft curve of her waist, the way her skin glowed in the dawn light, before returning to her face, his gaze reverent, hungry, but controlled. She closed the distance, her lips brushing his cheek, a kiss that was soft, deliberate, a thank you and a promise rolled into one. His stubble grazed her lips, a faint rasp that made her want to kiss him again, deeper, but she held back, letting the moment linger. Julian's breath hitched, and he turned his head, his lips grazing hers, not a full kiss but a whisper of one, a question unanswered. They stayed like that for a moment, foreheads nearly touching, breaths mingling, the world outside the room, a distant hum. Zoey's body was alive, still tingling from his touch, from the memory of how he'd felt inside her, how he'd held her like she was both fragile and unbreakable. Julian's hand lifted, his fingers brushing her jaw, tracing the line of her cheekbone, and she leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. "Do you want to remember last night?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper, but carrying a weight that made her heart skip. "Or do you want it to stay a secret?" Zoey opened her eyes, meeting his gaze, and saw the vulnerability there, the quiet hope that she'd choose to hold onto this, to carry it with her. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she leaned in again, her lips finding his cheek once more, another soft kiss, lingering this time, letting him feel her answer. It wasn't just about remembering. It was about claiming this moment, this night, as hers, as theirs. She pulled back, her smile small but real, and Julian's eyes softened, a flicker of relief passing through them. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. The dawn light grew stronger, painting the room in gold, and Zoey felt a quiet strength settle in her chest. She wasn't the same woman who'd walked into the Velvet Pulse last night, broken and searching. She was Zoey, whole, alive, and ready for whatever came next, even if it was just this moment, this man, this morning. They sat in silence for a while, the coffee cooling on the table, the world waking up outside. Zoey's fingers stayed tangled with his, her body still bare, her heart open in a way it hadn't been in years. Julian's thumb brushed her knuckles, a steady rhythm that anchored her, and she knew without saying it, that this wasn't the end. Not yet. The Chicago morning unfolded slowly, the city waking under a sky washed clean by the night's rain. Soft sunlight filtered through the downtown streets, glinting off wet pavement and casting long shadows that danced with the rhythm of a new day. Zoey Fan stepped out of the nondescript building, the cool air brushing her skin like a lover's farewell. Her red dress, slightly wrinkled from the night's abandon, still clung to her curves, accentuating the dip of her waist, the gentle swell of her breasts, and the smooth expanse of her thighs. At 27, she was a vision of quiet strength, her dark hair falling in loose waves over her shoulders, her kohl-lined eyes bright with a new clarity. Her crimson lipstick was gone, kissed away by Julian Reyes, but her lips, full and slightly swollen, curved into a faint, private smile. She felt different, lighter, freer, as if the weight of her past had been burned away in the heat of the night. Zoey paused on the sidewalk, her breath visible in the crisp air, and glanced back at the building. The window of their room was just visible, a small square of glass catching the morning light, but Julian wasn't there. He hadn't followed her out, hadn't tried to hold her back, and she hadn't expected him to. That wasn't what this was. Their night had been a collision of need and desire, a moment of raw connection that didn't come with promises or expectations. And yet, as she stood there, her heart gave a quiet thud, a whisper of something unfinished, something that lingered in the space between them. She adjusted the strap of her small purse, her fingers brushing the edge of her jacket, and felt a faint crinkle. Curious, she reached into the pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, small and unassuming. Her pulse quickened as she unfolded it, revealing a single line in Julian's handwriting, bold, slanted, as if written in a hurry but with care. "If you need another night, come back to the bar." The third drink's the sign. No phone number, no last name, just a cryptic invitation that felt like a dare. Zoey's lips parted, a soft laugh escaping her, equal parts amusement and intrigue. It was so him, not pushing, not demanding, but leaving the door open, letting her choose. She tucked the note back into her pocket, her fingers lingering on it, and turned to face the street. Chicago stretched out before her, a city of possibilities, its skyscrapers gleaming in the morning sun, its streets buzzing with early commuters and delivery trucks. Zoey felt a spark of something new in her chestnut love. Not yet, but a curiosity, a hunger for what might come next. The Zoey who'd walked into the Velvet Pulse last night, broken and searching, was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her own power, who'd tasted freedom in Julian's arms and wasn't ready to let it go. Her mind flickered back to him, Julian, with his bronzed skin and tattooed chest, his dark eyes that saw through her walls, his hands that had mapped her body with a reverence that still made her skin tingle. She could still feel the press of his lips, the heat of his breath against her ear, the way his voice had rumbled her name like a secret. His body, lean and strong, had been a canvas of stories she'd only begun to read, the tattoos curling over his arms, the faint scars that hinted at a life lived hard, the silver chain at his neck that had caught the light as he moved. He was a mystery, a man who gave just enough to make you want more, and Zoey couldn't shake the feeling that their story wasn't over. She started walking, her heels clicking softly on the pavement, her body moving with a confidence she hadn't felt in months. The city seemed to hum around her, alive with the promise of new beginnings. She passed a coffee shop, its windows steamed with warmth, and a street vendor selling flowers, their colors bright against the gray of the morning. Zoey didn't stop, but she let herself imagine what if she went back to the Velvet Pulse. What if she ordered that third drink, saw Julian smirk, felt his gaze pull her in again? Would it be another night of fire, or something more, something that could grow in the quiet spaces between their silences? The note in her pocket felt like a talisman, a reminder that she held the power to choose. She could leave it as a perfect memory, a night that had healed her, or she could step back into the Velvet Pulse and see where the music took her. The thought sent a shiver through her, not of fear but of excitement, the kind that made her heart race and her lips curve into a smile. Julian hadn't chased her, hadn't tried to cage her, and that made her want to find him again, to see what lay behind those dark eyes, what stories his tattoos told, what his laughter sounded like in the daylight. As she turned a corner, the city opening up before her, Zoey felt a quiet resolve settle in her chest. She wasn't running anymore, not from her past, not from herself. She was Zoey Fan, whole, alive, and ready for whatever came next. The Velvet Pulse was out there, waiting, and so was Julian, with his cryptic note and his dangerous smile. The third drink was a question, and Zoey wasn't sure yet what her answer would be, but she knew one thing: the story wasn't over. And for those of you listening, wondering what happens next, does Zoey walk back into that bar? Does Julian wait for her, pouring drinks and watching the door? Or is this just the start of something bigger, something neither of them saw coming? Stay tuned, because the next chapter of Zoey and Julian's story is coming, and it's going to burn brighter than ever. Follow my channel, hit that subscribe button, and don't miss what's waiting in the shadows of the Velvet Pulse. The third drink is calling. Will you be there to see what it means?